Hi class, welcome to week 10. As we discussed last week, you're now putting together your last individual speech, your persuasive speech. We've talked about different types of reasoning, how you construct your argument, but the one thing we didn't get to was the fallacies from chapter 17. Fallacies are weak arguments that rely on illogical statements. So, regardless of the method of reasoning you use, speakers must guard against logical fallacies in their presentations. A fallacy is an error in reasoning. There are 10 fallacies that seem to be the most common in student speeches, and those are the ones I'm going to be going over today. I'll also provide some links of examples if you want to go back and look at different examples of the fallacies. All right, so let's get started. So the first fallacy is hasty generalization. This is a common fallacy when you're using reasoning from specific instances, or also called inductive reasoning. Hasty generalization occurs when a speaker jumps to a conclusion on the basis of too few cases or on the basis of atypical cases. So here's an example of hasty generalization. Throughout American history, military leaders have always made excellent presidents. Look at the examples of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Dwight Eisenhower. The problem here is, Washington, Jackson, Eisenhower are widely regarded as outstanding presidents, but are these examples enough to conclude that military leaders make excellent presidents? No. What about James Buchanan, Ulysses S. Grant? They were both highly decorated military leaders, but they are usually rated among the nation's worst presidents. So obviously this is a hasty generalization here. The next one is the fallacy of false cause, mistakenly assuming that because one event follows another, the first event causes the second. It's also called post hoc reasoning. This occurs with causal reasoning, that you're automatically assuming that just because one event follows the other, also called black cat syndrome, it's caused the second. Usually the closeness of time may be purely coincidental. For example, when a team from the NFC wins the Super Bowl, economic growth during the next year is stronger than when a team from the AFC wins the Super Bowl. Therefore, if we want economic growth, we should root for a team from the NFC to win this year's Super Bowl. Although I would love that because I'm an NFC fan, this is obviously a post hoc reasoning or a false cause. There is no causal connection between the two events. Whether the American economy rises or falls is not dependent on who wins the Super Bowl. Invalid analogy occurs with if you're reasoning through analogy. Two cases being compared are not essentially alike. As discussed last week, when reasoning with analogy, a speaker concludes that what is true for one case is also true for the other. But an invalid analogy will occur when the two cases being compared are not alike. So you need to make sure that what you're comparing, like I discussed last week, are alike to make sure that this reasoning is valid. Here's an example of an invalid analogy. Employees are like nails. Just as nails must be hit on the head to get them to work, so must employees. No, that's obviously invalid. This statement is an absolute fallacy. No one in his or her right mind can seriously think that employees, which are human beings, can be compared with inanimate objects such as nails. So determining whether an analogy is valid or invalid is not always easy. If you have one and you want me to take a look at it, feel free to come see me during office hours, and I'd be happy to look at your reasoning from analogy to make sure it's not a fallacy. The next fallacy, the bandwagon fallacy. Because something is popular, it is good or correct. The bandwagon fallacy assumes that because something is popular, because people like it, because people are all doing it, it is therefore good, correct, or desirable. But obviously that is not always the case. So here's an example of the bandwagon fallacy. The governor must be correct in his approach to social policy. After all, the polls show that 60% of the people support him. What if 60% of the people have no idea what they're talking about? This statement is a fallacy because popular opinion cannot be taken as proof that an idea is right or wrong. Remember, everyone used to believe that the world is flat. everyone used to believe that space flight was impossible. Much of advertising is based on the bandwagon principle, but this example is not from advertising. The link here is actually really funny. It has a lot of different fallacies in it, and the bandwagon fallacy from Saturday Night Live is a really good example of why it's not always true. The next example of fallacies is called the red herring. This is the name comes from a trick used by farmers in England to keep fox hunters and their hounds from galloping through their crops. By dragging a smoked herring with a strong odor along the edge of their fields, the farmer could throw the dogs off track by destroying the scent of the fox. This is true for the red herring fallacy. It introduces an irrelevant issue in order to divert attention from the subject under discussion. If you've watched any political debate, politicians use this all the time. So here's an example. How dare my opponents accuse me of political corruption at a time when we are working to improve the quality of life for all people in the United States? So as you can see, like I said, what does the speaker's concern with the quality of life in the U.S. have to do with whether he or she is guilty of political corruption? It is a red herring used to divert attention away from the real issue. So, like I said, politicians use this all the time. Instead of answering the question, they divert the issue and talk about something else. Another fallacy used by politicians is called the ad hominem. They attack the person rather than dealing with the issue. This is Latin for against the man. The ad hominem fallacy substitutes an attack on a person instead of discussing the real issue for dispute. So you don't want to do this with your counter argument. Remember, counter arguments are required in your speech. Make sure you're not using the ad hominem fallacy. Don't attack the other side. Attack their issue. Attack their argument. So here's another example. The head of the Commerce Commission has a number of interesting economic proposals, but let's not forget that she comes from a very wealthy family. By attacking the commissioner's family background rather than dealing with the substance of her economic proposals, the speaker is engaging in an ad hominem attack. The next fallacy is called the either-or fallacy, forcing choice between two alternatives when more than two exist. So this is also called a false dilemma. It forces the listener to choose between two alternatives, but sometimes those aren't the only alternatives available. So here's an example. The government must either raise taxes or eliminate services for the poor. This statement oversimplifies a very complex issue by reducing it to simply an either-or choice. Is it true that the only two choices are raising taxes or eliminating services for the poor? What about cutting the administrative costs of government, eliminating pork barrel projects? There is a lot of other examples in here besides the two being presented. The slippery slope fallacy, I see this a lot in speeches of, a very, very delicate nature. A lot of speeches with speeches of value use the slippery slope fallacy. So this assumes that the first step will lead to later steps that can't be prevented. It assumes that taking a first step will lead to disaster, basically. That if one thing happens, all these other things will happen. So here's an example that I thought was actually pretty funny from your text. Now that the TSA is allowed to use full body scanners and invasive pat-downs before letting us through security, it's only a matter of time before they strip search every man, woman, and child who wants to fly on a plane. So if the speaker claims that taking a first step will inevitably lead to a series of disastrous later steps, he or she needs to provide evidence or reasoning to support this claim. To assume that all the later steps will occur without providing evidence is the slippery slope fallacy. The next fallacy is called appealing to tradition. I see this a lot with questions of value as well. You assume that something that's old is automatically better than something new. But you have to remember that just because we've done something forever doesn't make it right. Again, you need to provide evidence on why it is right. So here's an example, and actually, this is an example from your text that is pretty recent. This was just used in the last presidential election. I don't see any reason to abolish the Electoral College. It has been around since the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and we should keep it as long as the United States continues to exist. There is a good argument on both sides of the debate over abolishing the Electoral College. However, to conclude that the Electoral College should be kept solely because it's part of the U.S. Constitution commits a fallacy of appealing to tradition. So, on the other side, the opposite of appealing to tradition is appealing to novelty, assuming that something new is automatically better. So, the appeal to novelty fallacy occurs when the speaker assumes that because something is new, it is therefore superior. The thing I always think about when I think of the appealing to novelty fallacy are cell phones. Cell phones come out and they say it's new, it's better. Why is it better? They don't always tell us. So here's another example from your text. Our church should adopt the 2011 New International Version of the Bible because it is 400 years newer than the King James Version. This last one's not your text, but I see it a lot in speeches, so I thought I would just introduce it. And if you use this link, it's a kind of a funny example of what's called a non sequitur. It does not follow an idea or conclusion that does not follow logically based on the evidence. So non sequitur, that's what it just means. It means that you're reaching a conclusion based on a faulty premise. So those are all the fallacies that I'd like you to know and avoid in your persuasive speeches. These fallacies won't be on quiz 4, but they will be on the final exam. So make sure you understand the fallacies from chapter 17, and as always, feel free to let me know any questions you may have.